how do you get to know a person? Well, I guess first you probably need to spend some time with them, don't you? And so an important way of getting to know someone is noticing how they interact with others. Are they nice? Are they maybe rude? Are they happy? Are they negative? What are they like? Do they open doors for people? Are they gracious? How do they treat people who are unkind to them? The way someone relates to another person gives insight into that person's character. So we see in Scripture God interacting with humans just like you and I. And so these interactions, we can glean many things about the character of God. So one such biblical relationship, one such interaction we read in the Bible is the relationship between God and Moses. This evening, my aim is not simply to highlight the events of the life of Moses, but to examine those events in the light of God's influence and God's guidance in the life of Moses from his birth until his death. Now, the title of tonight's study is Moses' God is Our God. Before we open up our Bibles, let's briefly give some backstory on why Moses, a Hebrew, was born in Egypt in the first place. If you'll recall, Joseph was a Hebrew, and he served as second in command in all of Egypt. So God helped Joseph to help Egypt have a supply of food when there was a severe famine in the land. And so as Joseph helped the people of Egypt have food in the midst of a famine, you can imagine they were very grateful to Joseph. And as a result, Joseph was allowed to invite many of his kinsmen to live in Egypt with him. However, as the years passed, the number of Hebrews grew and grew. And so those in authority saw how many Hebrews there started to be, and they kind of got a little nervous. And so as years went by, the people in authority no longer had the same affinity for the Hebrews as had their predecessors. And so the Hebrew people fell out of favor with the leaders of Egypt, and it came to a point where the Hebrews were made slaves. The Hebrews were made slaves. Furthermore, so the Hebrews could not present a military threat, a decree was made by Pharaoh saying that every Hebrew male child should be destroyed. And so let's open our Bibles tonight to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. We're going to be reading from verse 1 through verse 10. Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughters of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So what we find in verse 1, we read about a Hebrew couple having a son. Now, when you have a child, that's a very joyous time. But now this Hebrew couple was frightened because the Pharaoh of Egypt had issued a decree that all male Hebrew children were to be destroyed. And so the child that this couple had was a male child. And it's interesting to note that both the mother and the father were of the priestly tribe of Levi. And so, after birth, this child was hidden for 3 months. And so then comes the account that you and I probably first heard about in Sunday school. The mother of the child made a basket and made it waterproof and placed the child in it safely and put the basket on the river's edge, knowing that Pharaoh's daughter normally went there when she bathed, and she would likely see the basket. And hopefully, Pharaoh's daughter would have compassion upon the child. So things went according to plan. Pharaoh's daughter went out, and she found the basket, and she had compassion for the child. And so about that time, the infant's sister came to Pharaoh's daughter, asking if Pharaoh's daughter would like to have a Hebrew woman to nurse the infant that Pharaoh's daughter just found. And so that suggestion seemed to be a pretty good idea to Pharaoh's daughter. And so she sent the Hebrew girl to get the Hebrew woman to help her with the infant. Now we know that this Hebrew woman that was sent for was the child's real mother. So get this. Pharaoh's daughter hired the child's real mother to care for her own child. That's pretty good, isn't it? And so this child would later become Pharaoh's daughter's son. And so Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses. And what's important about the name Moses is the name means to be drawn out. And so in this case, Moses, the baby, was drawn out of the water. And so there's a significance to the name Moses. And so through these first 10 verses that we read, we see that God was the author of this unlikely scenario. Everything had to go just right. And so Pharaoh's daughter had to be in the right place, and the baby had to be put in the right place, and all these things had to work just so for this whole plan to work, so that Moses, this child, this Hebrew child, so that his life would be spared. And also, it's interesting that Pharaoh, who issued this decree that all these Hebrew male babies would be killed, it's his daughter that found the baby, and it's his daughter that took this Hebrew child as her own son. And so Moses would be living in Pharaoh's palace, no less. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting how God works? So through all this, God preserved Moses' life despite this decree of Pharaoh calling for the death of all Hebrew male children. So Moses was among the elite in Egypt. As Pharaoh's daughter's son, he enjoyed the finest of everything. including the best education to be had in all of Egypt. And so all was sweet for this Hebrew man in Egypt until. If you'll follow along with me as we resume reading in chapter 2, verse 11. Chapter 2, verse 11. Chapter 2, verse 11. Then we'll see what else happens. Chapter 2, verse 11. And then we're going to read from verse 11 through verse 15. Chapter 2, verse 11. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to them that did wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So it's obvious here that Moses is aware that he is a Hebrew. I'd say it probably has a lot to do with the appearance. I'd say that probably Hebrews look different than Egyptians do. So he is aware that he's not a native Egyptian. He knows that he's a Hebrew. And so Moses noticed in Egypt that his fellow Hebrews were not being treated well at all. And so Moses actually saw an Egyptian hitting a Hebrew man. And so we see that Moses looked one way, then he looked the other, and so Moses decided to intervene in the situation. And we read in verse 12 that Moses ended up killing this Egyptian and hiding his dead body in the sand. So Moses thought that he was in the clear. No one saw anything, or so he thought. But the very next day, Moses tried to break up a dispute between 2 Hebrew males and found out that his killing the Egyptian was no secret at all. And so Moses got worried real fast. And it turns out that worry was justified because when Pharaoh heard about what Moses did, he sought to kill Moses. So Moses got away as quick as he possibly could, and he settled in Midian. So at this time, Moses was 40 years old. And so as readers, you and I can read this, and we know how much of a plan that God had for Moses. And we know how God spared Moses' life for a specific purpose. But Moses couldn't see the big picture, could he? Moses was just intent on keeping alive and laying low. So we read in Genesis 15:13 that God had said that his people, the Hebrews, would be in the land of Egypt as slaves for 400 years. For 400 years. But at this point in history, they had only been slaves for 360. So God had need of Moses for a specific duty, but the realization of what Moses had been called to do was not going to be fulfilled for another 40 years. So we got 40 years. What's going to happen between that time and the time it was supposed to be fulfilled? And so, although Moses was on the lam, he was on the run, we realize that God had not given up on Moses, even when it seemed that Moses, for the most part, probably thought his life was about over, because he was scared that any minute that one of the Pharaoh's officers would catch him, and then he would be executed. You know, when Moses was in exile in Midian for 40 years, I'd say he probably had a lot of time to think, don't you? Why did I do that? What caused me to just do that, to murder somebody in cold blood? And so what Moses was thinking as a hopeless time, why am I here? I'm in a place that I don't know anything about. I'm far from where I grew up. He was probably hopeless. What Moses viewed as hopeless, God viewed as 40 years of additional training for the calling that God had specifically had in mind for Moses. So Moses goes to Midian, and he's there for 40 years. While he's there, Moses takes a wife, and he has a son by the name of Gershon. And Gershon's name means stranger there. Interesting, I think. And so what Moses did there was he had a humble existence. Moses worked for his father-in-law as a shepherd. So Moses went from living in the palace of Pharaoh to working as a shepherd for his father-in-law. Big difference. And so as we move along in this narrative of Moses, at this point, after being in Midian for 40 years, he is now 80 years old. And some might say that those 40 years as a shepherd were just wasted years, when Moses was in the prime of his life and could have been doing so much other things rather than being a shepherd. Many would say just wasted time. God would surely disagree that those years were wasted. Whatever it is that Moses learned during that time was obviously very important in Moses being properly equipped to help the people through the power of God. Having said this, let's turn in our Bibles to Exodus 3. We're going to read verses 6 through 14. Exodus 3, verse 6. Exodus 3, verse 6. Exodus 3, verse 6. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I've also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee to Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say unto me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, I am sent me unto you. Many, many things in these verses that we can spend hours on. But what we'll do is we'll just hit some of the highlights of these verses. Although, like I said, many, many things to talk about. In these verses, God dramatically speaks through Moses through a bush that was on fire but was not consumed. the bush was on fire, flaming, but it wasn't consumed. So God gave Moses instructions about what God wanted Moses to do. So evidently, being in that wilderness, being a shepherd for all those years, did something to humble Moses. Moses was no longer the brash man who lived in Egypt for years enjoying the finest of everything. Moses was different. Moses was changed. Moses was now humble. And so God was with Moses. And so God was with Moses equally during his youth in the palace as well as in his years as he was a shepherd to his father-in-law's herd. And throughout all these years of Moses' life, God was shaping Moses. It was like a skilled craftsman as they take clay and they mold. Minute by minute, they're molding the clay into the desired product. That's what God was doing in Moses' life. And God took a lot of time to do that, but God wanted to do things right, and God is a God who does things right. So God carefully used all this time to form Moses into what Moses was at this time. And so Moses was ready for the mission in which he was to be trained. Moses had received the training, and he was ready. However, the enormity of the task that God was telling him to do was just overwhelming. It's like, you want me to do this? So I know a lot of times when we are asked to do things that we don't know if we can do, it can be overwhelming, can't it? And so we can take encouragement that Moses was overwhelmed just like we are sometimes. And so, actually, Moses tried to explain to God how God may have not exercised the utmost wisdom in selecting him. Can you imagine that? Moses tried to explain to God that, hey, God, I know that you're God, but you might not have picked the right person. Imagine that. Let's go ahead and look at Exodus 4:10. Exodus 4:10. And let's see what this Moses feels like that he has the gall to say to God. Exodus 4:10. We're going to read from verse 10 through verse 12. Exodus 4:10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who made man's mouth? Who maketh the dumb, the deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have I not the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. And so Moses was trying his best to squeeze out of it, right? He had self-doubt. He was trying to weasel himself out of it. And he was even saying, God, I don't think you picked the right person. And so, in verse 10, Moses makes his excuse. And God graciously but firmly put Moses in his place in verses 11 and 12, doesn't he? And so this task wasn't about Moses primarily. It was about God. Moses hadn't prepared himself for the task, but God had prepared Moses. And so as God preparing Moses, God alone could say whether Moses was ready or not. And so later on, we read Moses was obedient to go to Pharaoh and say what he was commanded to say by the Lord. And so we also know that Pharaoh was stubborn, and Pharaoh would not permit the Hebrews to leave Egypt. But through God's plagues and the Passover that God instituted, Pharaoh finally relented, and the people were on their way out of Egypt. The Hebrews were on their way out of Egypt. And so it was still about God, because it wasn't Moses' persuasiveness or cleverness that brought the people of Israel, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. It was God working through Moses as his human instrument. We then know that the Hebrews were with their backs to the sea, and they were facing Pharaoh's army in front of them. So again, it wasn't about Moses, or it wasn't about the people's ability. It was about God. God parted the Red Sea for the Hebrews to pass through on dry land. And also, God closed the sea back up on Pharaoh's army. It was God that did it. It wasn't any skill that Moses had. It wasn't any skill that the Hebrew people had. It was God. And then later on, as Moses and the Hebrews are in their exodus, that things weren't hinging on Moses, and they weren't hinging on the Hebrews' abilities for it to happen. The Exodus was a work of God. God, through his power, was able to get the people of Israel, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. And the Hebrews were simply allowed to take part in it. They weren't responsible for it, but they were able to take part in it. And so we read in the later chapters, as the Lord led the people by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, that Moses, he wasn't even charting the course. He wasn't even telling the people where to stay. It was God. So in this instance also, it was about God and not about the people. And so when Moses had the 10 Commandments that were written on those stones, you remember where Moses literally broke one of these stones, but God showed that the stone that the commandment was written on, it didn't hold any power. However, God's word and authority did. So unfortunately, Moses did a lot of good things, but unfortunately, Moses had an hour of supreme arrogance. And in this moment, when Moses saw the entrance into the promised land forfeited by his actions, the reason why it happened, he tried to place himself alongside God. So let's go ahead and turn to Numbers chapter 20, verse 7. Numbers 20, verse 7. Numbers 20, verse 7. Numbers 20, verse 7. We'll read from verse 7 of Numbers 20 through verse 12. Numbers 20, verse 7. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod and gather the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth water. Thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock, so thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock. And he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and the beasts also. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, Because ye believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. So the Hebrews were traveling in the wilderness. And just like anybody that travels anywhere for a long period of time, you get irritable. And when you consider how many Hebrews were traveling, we were talking about 1 million plus. We're talking about a lot of people. And there was a whole lot of backbiting. There was a whole lot of belly aching going on. And these people were cranky, they were fickle, and they were selfish. And at this point, they were having a hissy fit. So the Lord told Moses and Aaron, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the people water. Just go to the rock, speak to it, and the people will get water. The people and the beast will have their water. And so God told Moses, this is very important to see here. God told Moses to speak to the rock. To speak to the rock. And the water would come forth for the people. However, Moses in his arrogance, his thinking too much of himself, he actually says, must we? Look in verse 10. Must we? Do you think that he was talking about him and Aaron or Moses and God? A lot of commentators seem to think that Moses was saying, where we see this we in verse 10, it was me and God. Must we put up with y'all? Must we give y'all water? And instead of speaking to the rock as he had been told by God, Moses struck the rock instead twice. Now this may seem like a minor detail to you and I. Instead of speaking to it, he hit it twice. But consider this. Moses disobeyed God in front of the whole Hebrew nation. God could not and did not let this pass. Moses had lost sight that every aspect of life is about God first and foremost. When he rebelled, he was disqualified to see the promised land that God had promised the Hebrew people. Now, God was very gracious, right? He could have struck Moses dead when Moses disobeyed him. But what he did was, because Moses did what was contrary to what God told him to do, Moses was then disqualified for going into the promised land. Now, some people might think this is overly harsh, but remember, as God's representative, Moses had a lot of responsibility. The people looked to him as like almost God, because the people took their instructions from Moses, and Moses took his instructions from God. And so, as God's representative, Moses encroached upon God's character by his disobedience. God is holy. And as God's representative to the Hebrew people, when Moses encroached upon God's character, that didn't look good on God, did it? That didn't look good on God at all, actually. And so God is a loving God. We could all agree with that, but he could not let this pass. Moses could receive forgiveness for this sin, but the sin of Moses carried consequences that were unalterable. And as we mentioned, the consequence was that he was not able to enter into the promised land. Finally, let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34. And I promise that's my last passage. Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy 34. Deuteronomy 34. We're going to read from verse 1 to verse 7 of Deuteronomy chapter 34. Chapter 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34, starting at verse 1. We're going to read from verse 1 through verse 7. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah that is over against Jericho. And the Lord shew him all the land of Gilead unto Dan. and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zor. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And they buried him in a valley of the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth the sculpture unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. So Moses was 120 years old. 120. And so he was compassionately allowed by God to see the promised land. Now God had to punish Moses because he did something that he should not have done, but God was still gracious enough to allow Moses to see the promised land. And so we even read in verse 7, look with me at verse 7. We read that when Moses died, he was in sterling health. In sterling health. It said that when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. He was in good shape. But it was the Lord's will that he would die at that time, and that's what happened. And so Moses was used to bring the people to the promised land, and we know that Joshua was used by the Lord to bring them into the promised land. And so we have touched briefly on Moses' birth, a few things about Moses' eventful life, and we also touched briefly on his death. There are so many things that we could say about Moses. We just don't simply have enough time this evening. But what we learned about Moses was about how God dealt with Moses. We not only learned something about Moses, but moreover, we learned a lot about God, I think. What are some of the things that we learned about God as we listen to these verses? What did we learn about God? What are some of the character traits about God that we saw in these verses? Definitely, God is a planner. He's definitely faithful. Any others? Right, that's great. You're right. God is in control. Others?
There's a song about God loves you. Me and Brandon are going to sing it up here one day.
Well, I'll look forward to that. Okay, I'll look forward to that. And some of the other things, God is holy. God is compassionate. God is stern in his discipline, but gracious to those he disciplines. He's stern and he's gracious at the same time. And so God is even gracious when his people disappoint him. And so we could probably go on for a long time just picking things out from these verses about God that just we can see about God from his interactions with Moses and in the life of Moses. So I hope that you benefited from the time of looking at this life of Moses. Moreover, I hope that you will remember the character traits that we saw of God in this hour. So when we are confused about God and his character, who is God? It's helpful to remind ourselves that the God we serve is the exact same one that Moses served. And so when we see God's character portrayed in his interaction with Moses, we know that that's the same God that we serve. And so God wants us to be trained. Many times God will put us in situations that are uncomfortable, but you know what? God is training us just like he trained Moses there in the wilderness for 40 years. He has a plan for you and I. There are things that he wants to accomplish that require extra training. He wants us to be people of understanding and not people of error. And so I thank you for the privilege of speaking tonight, and I thank you for your kind attention. Okay, Sam, if I can ask you to close this in prayer, please. If I can ask you to close this in prayer. If I can ask you to close this in prayer.